We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another great webinar with the School of Public Policy and specifically the Simpson Center. So thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Carrie Oosterhuis, and I am a field editor with Real Agriculture, and I'm excited to bring to you today's webinar as your moderator. So as we know, today's webinar is titled "Are Farms Driving Our GHG Emissions? Climate Policy for Canadian Farmers." So GHG emissions is an issue impacting every sector in Canada, including agriculture. But a farm feels the impacts of taxes and the challenges of measurement very differently than a city household does. Where do most of the emissions on a farm come from, and what makes them so different? What do the numbers look like, and how can emissions be measured in a quantifiable way? Given what we know about the sources and levels, what does that mean in terms of taxes and legislations aimed at emissions reductions for farmers and producers? Now, as I said, this webinar today, if you've never attended one of these webinars, A, you are in for a treat. It is always a fun time. And B, we're going to go for about an hour. The first half is going to be presentations, and the second half is going to be a full open Q&A session. So please be sure to put those questions into the Q&A box here on Zoom. And we won't get to them till after the presentation, but if any questions come up while you guys are listening to the presentations, I know how easy it is to forget them. So please feel free to put them in, and I will make sure our speakers today answer them for you. So first up on today's speaker list is Dr. Josh Barasa. He's a research associate with the Simpson Center of the School of Public Policy. And after him, we're going to have Dr. Sarah Dobson join us. So Joshua Barossa is a research associate at the Simpson Center and is part of the center's carbon program. His current research focus is on Canadian climate change policy and its effects on Alberta's ag sector. Josh graduated from the University of Manitoba in 2017 with a Bachelor of Science in Agribusiness and is now pursuing his master's in agricultural economics, also from the U of M. Dr. Sarah Dobson is a research associate in the Energy and Environmental Policy Research Division at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Her research focuses on the design, implementation, and evaluation of energy and environmental regulatory policy. Sarah's recent work with the School of Public Policy primarily centers on climate change policy, with an emphasis on carbon pricing support policies for large industrial emitters, methane emissions policy, and the application of the carbon tax to agriculture. As I said, first up, we will have Josh. So Josh, whenever you are ready, please feel free to take it away.
All right. So first off, I just want to point out that I am not a doctor. I haven't graduated with my master's degree quite yet. So hopefully in a couple of years, but not quite yet. So good morning. I'm Josh Barasa. I'm a research associate at the Simpson Center, and as mentioned, part of the carbon program. And today I'll be presenting a bit, or providing a bit of an introduction to greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector, really to provide the background information for Sarah's presentation. So to start out, the national greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, which can be seen in the red line on the graph, between 1990 and 2019 has grown considerably. So it started off in 1990 around 600 megatons of CO2 equivalent, and has grown to about 730 with our most recent measurements. Now, for Canada to meet its emission reduction targets through the Paris Climate Agreement and other or Paris Climate Agreement, with this most recent enhanced nationally determined contribution, emissions are going to have to fall by roughly 290 megatons of CO2, which would be about a 29-30 megaton decrease per year. So it is quite considerable where Canada needs to go over the next decade. Now, taking a look at some of those underlying sources, this is broken down by the Canadian economic sectors, which is reported in the National Inventory Report. What we see is oil and gas and transportation have grown considerably over this period and have really been the growing sectors in terms of emissions. With looking at some of those smaller groupings or the smaller groups, we have electricity, which has dropped from almost by half from the early 2000s. Heavy industry, building, and agriculture, which is shown in green.
Just a quick pause here, Josh. I'm just getting some questions here in the Q&A saying they're not seeing your slides. Do you guys want to, I can see your slides fine. Does somebody want to comment if that has cleared up? I just had a couple comments, so I want to make sure we are getting them there. Okay, they just popped up now, so we can hopefully get back to it. Sorry about that, Josh.
Oh, sorry about the confusion there. All right. Actually, should I go back through that quickly, or is that good?
That should be okay. I think people were just questioning about the graph, so maybe if you throw the graph back up, because you're talking about the red line, and they said they weren't able to see the red line. So if you could pull that one back up, that would be terrific.
Yeah, it's currently up right now.
Oh, I'm not seeing it at all right now anymore. I don't know if anyone else.
Let me try that again.
No worries. There we go. Now I am seeing it. If somebody wants to maybe pop in the comments again, if you guys are seeing it, that would be terrific. I can see it. There we go. Okay,
all right.
We're good to go. Thanks.
Well, I do apologize for that. Yeah, so if we take a look at that red line, that is going to be the Canada's national greenhouse gas inventory. So you can see it growing from the early 1990s to about 2007. There is a rather large decrease between 2007 and 2009. And since then, it has been growing. That the enhanced NDC is Canada's nationally determined contribution. That is the emission target Canada set, and this is the most recent one, which was set over the summer, which replaced our original one, which is a 30% reduction. So emissions to reach that will have to fall by about 29-30 megatons a year between 2020 and 2030. So quite a long ways to go. Looking at the distribution of the emissions by sector, what we have is about 50% of total greenhouse gas emissions coming from the oil and gas and transportation sectors. Building, heavy industry, ag, and electricity are all very similar in terms of total emissions, between 8 and 12%, with waste and other making up a fairly small portion, about 7% combined. When we look at ag has remained about 10% of total emissions since the 1990s. And so while emissions have grown, they have remained relatively constant, or relatively the same over that period. And when we take a look at the distribution of emissions by gas source, what we can see is that within Canada, 81% of total emissions are going to be coming from CO2, with smaller shares coming from methane, CH4 at about 14%, and N2O, nitrous oxide, at 5%. Agriculture's distribution of emissions doesn't really follow the overall distribution. What we can see is that of CO2 emissions, about 2.5% are going to be coming from agriculture. And when you start looking at CH4 and N2O, they're going to be making up much larger shares at about 30% of methane and 80% of nitrous oxide. Now, this does have some implications, especially with a lot of the focus on the federal government to be reducing those CO2 emissions. It isn't going to have a very large effect on ag, and those CO2 emissions are going to be coming primarily from on-farm fuel use, which for the most part is going to be exempt from something like the carbon tax. A lot of ag's emissions are going to be coming from byproducts of natural or biological processes, something like digestion through enteric fermentation, or decomposition of manure, or the application of nitrogen fertilizer. Now, looking at agricultural emissions over that same period, again, you can see that emissions have grown from 57 to 73 megatons over this period. But underlying those emissions, there are going to be some different trends. So for animal production, what we found was that, or was observed, was that emissions increased from 1990 to about 2005 and then dropped steadily. And that decrease between 2005 and 2011 was brought about by a decrease in the national cattle herd as a result of the BSE outbreak. Now, those decreases in emissions have primarily been offset by the growth in emissions from crop production. And this is going to be coming in, really being attributed to increased emissions from nitrous oxide, or increased emissions from nitrous oxide as a result of increased nitrogen fertilizer use, and is currently one of the few targets of national emissions reductions policy in the ag sector. We can start looking at the distribution of these emissions, starting with animal production. And animal production accounts for about 48% of total emissions, or at least as of 2019, of which 67% is going to be coming from enteric fermentation, with 22% from manure management, and 10% from manure left on pasture, rangeland, and paddocks. Now, enteric fermentation is going to be primarily originating from cattle, about 96% of enteric fermentation, or 31% of total agricultural emissions. With manure management, this is going to be split and really 60-40 between cattle and other sectors. And when I discuss manure management, it is really the handling and storage of manure, so with a specific animal waste management system, whereas manure left on pasture, range, and paddock is just unmanaged, or not to the same extent. When we take a look at crop production, it's going to be 32% of total emissions, with the majority coming in the form of N2O emissions from agricultural soils. That's going to be around 88%. And of those, 60% is going to be coming from direct fertilizer use. So there's still indirect fertilizer-based emissions, but those are going to fall within that other category. Now, the other major crop production emission source is going to be from carbon-containing, or CO2 emissions from carbon-containing fertilizers, and it's approximately 11% of crop production emissions. The last group, on-farm fuel use, is going to be really that burning of fossil fuels for one, transportation. So that's going to be the use of off-road vehicles, like you have tractors and combines and other farm vehicles, as well as stationary combustion. And stationary combustion is where a lot of the controversies around the carbon tax is going to fall in relation to agriculture, with what is going to be exempt and what's not. And that's going to be heating and cooling of barns, heating of greenhouses, and grain drying. Now, we could expand the definition of agricultural emissions a little bit further, and we can cover a number of different sources. And this would fall under pre and post production. The FAO does a very good job of providing these estimates every year to try to get a more or larger view of ag emissions. And within Canada, we're looking at about 13% of emissions coming from, 13% of total agri-food emissions coming from transportation. And this is going to be the moving of like fertilizer to farm, or farm products for manufacturing and processing and throughout the supply chain. Fertilizer manufacturing is going to be about 12% of these total emissions. Packaging and processing is going to be around 6%, with waste at 5%, consumption at 5%, and retail at 5%, or at 3%. Now, when we start looking at the breakdown between the two for pre and post production, what we have is about 54% is coming from the production side, and 46% is coming from that pre and post production mark. And when we start to look at where are these major emission sources within the ag sector, on-farm fuel use is quite small at 11 or 12% of these total agri-food emissions. The big ones really being emissions from beef and dairy production at 20%, as well as emissions from direct fertilizer-based emissions, either through crop production or through fertilizer manufacturing. And now, taking a step back and looking at how ag fits into the national emission estimates, when we start to incorporate that pre and post production, it's going to be about 19%, with 10% coming from agriculture or ag production and 9% from that pre and post production estimate. And we can continue to expand this by looking at emissions from cropland or carbon or removals from cropland, where annually you are looking at around 5.5 megatons of CO2 being removed, or which comes out to roughly around 116 kilograms a hectare a year. However, there is quite a bit of variation between regions, with Alberta and parts of Saskatchewan removing close to a half a ton, depending on the region, to the opposite, where emissions are going to be around the same, but in terms of emissions and not removals. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josh. Next up, we are going to have Dr. Sarah Dobson. So Sarah, whenever you are ready. And as I said, if you guys have any questions or comments, I'm seeing some of your questions come in, so that is just terrific. And we will get to them right after Sarah's presentation. So be sure. And as well, if there's any specific questions you have that you want me to direct at Sarah or Josh, let me know as well, and I will get that done for you. Okay, Sarah, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thanks so much. Okay, I've started sharing the screen, I believe. So yeah, if there's any issues, please just let me know. So thank you so much, Kara, for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with everyone today. So I'm going to be talking about the application of carbon pricing in Canada to agricultural emissions. So as we saw in Josh's presentation, agricultural emissions come from a diverse range of sources. But as Josh alluded to, when we start thinking about carbon pricing and looking at carbon pricing in relation to agricultural emissions, we see that it's only a very small share of emissions from the industry that are actually priced. So starting with an overview of carbon pricing across Canada, we actually don't have a uniform system across the country. So what happened when the federal government announced its intent to introduce a national carbon price in 2016 is it gave the provinces the option of implementing their own system that met specific criteria laid out by the federal government, or alternatively, having a federal system imposed in its place. So what we've ended up with is a mixture of programs across the country. So we have 6 jurisdictions: British Columbia, the Northwest Territories, Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland and Labrador that have purely provincial programs. We have 4 jurisdictions currently: Manitoba, Ontario, the Yukon Territory, and Nunavut that have fully opted into the federal carbon pricing program. And then we have 3 jurisdictions currently: Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Prince Edward Island, and Ontario joining them in 2022 that have a hybrid system. Part of the carbon price is imposed through the federal system, and part is imposed through a provincial system. So if we think of this from the perspective of agriculture, just a couple of things to note. One is that although the exact emissions that face the carbon tax will differ by jurisdiction, one consistency is that none of the carbon prices apply to non-combustion emissions from agriculture. So we're really only looking at the carbon tax potentially applying to on-farm fuel use. And again, the specific application will depend on the jurisdiction. The other thing to note is that farms typically do not meet the criteria to be classified as a large industrial emitter. So that requires a facility to have emissions greater than 10,000 kilotons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. Only a very small number of farms, specifically a small number of greenhouse operators, meet this criteria. So when we're thinking about farmers paying the carbon tax, it's primarily on fuel that they purchase from distributors, so natural gas, potentially small amounts of diesel as well. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to focus specifically on the federal carbon tax, which is just noted, applies in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario. Yukon and Nunavut as well, but agricultural activity is very limited in those jurisdictions. So as Josh pointed out, when we're thinking about on-farm fuel use, we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions from stationary combustion and transportation. So the federal carbon tax only applies to those two sources. So it's primarily paid on fuel that is purchased from fuel distributors. So individuals or businesses and individuals paying the tax, we include households, small businesses, we'd include farmers in this category, and then the MUSH sector, so municipalities, universities, schools, and hospitals. So one thing to note about the federal carbon tax is it's been set up so that all direct proceeds from the carbon tax are returned to the province of origin. But significantly, 90% of that revenue is going back to households. So farmers will receive that rebate in their personal capacity. They'll actually receive a small supplement, most of them. There's a supplement of an additional 10% on the lump sum payment for rural households, but that's intended to compensate farmers for their personal use. So heating of their personal homes, driving their personal vehicles. We don't have really a mechanism set up currently to compensate farmers for carbon taxes paid on fuel use for their business. So looking at the carbon tax applied to agriculture, Josh sort of also alluded to this in his presentation. We have three treatments of combustion emissions from agriculture. So the first category are emissions that are fully exempt from the carbon tax. So this is gasoline and light fuel oil, diesel specifically, that's used for the purposes of farming or in the operation of eligible farming machinery. So this is fuel that is used in farm vehicles. So for example, a farm truck or a tractor, as well as fuel that is used in an industrial machine or another stationary engine. So about the only category that would be excluded here, or that is explicitly excluded, not included as an eligible farm activity, would be any liquid fuels that are potentially used for the heating of farm buildings. So if you had a generator that was run on diesel, for example, that would not be eligible for the full exemption from the carbon tax. Our next category of emissions is a very specific program that's targeted at greenhouse growers, and they're eligible for an exemption of 80% on carbon taxes paid on fuel use, specifically natural gas or propane, that is used for the heating of greenhouses. And then finally, we have the full amount of the carbon tax. So that's levied on all other farm fuel consumption. As Josh alluded to, the most significant sources we're looking at here are natural gas and propane use that's used for grain and oilseed drying, as well as the heating of farm buildings. So to try and get a sense of what are farmers actually paying in the carbon tax, I'm going to start sort of theoretically at the national level. I know I noted earlier that the federal carbon tax doesn't apply across the country, but at the national level, we do actually have a breakdown between gaseous fuels and liquid fuels, which I think provides an interesting insight. So first thing to note, transportation emissions are completely attributable to liquid fuels by Environment and Climate Change Canada. So we would expect all transportation emissions all transportation emissions from farm vehicles to be fully exempt from the carbon tax. If we move over to stationary combustion, we're looking at about a 2/3, 1/3 split. So 2/3 are gaseous fuels. So again, some of these fuels would be eligible for the partial exemption if they're being used by greenhouse growers, whereas some of that amount would face the full amount of the carbon tax. Similarly, liquid fuels and stationary combustion, We'd probably expect that most of those are exempt from the carbon tax, but we may have some small amounts that do face the tax. I'll also note forestry emissions are included. They get grouped together when Environment and Climate Change Canada reports in the National Inventory Report. But I just note for stationary combustion, we're only looking at 76 kilotons of emissions attributable to forestry. So wouldn't make a difference really when we're looking at the breakdown for agriculture. So moving to the second graph, B, this is just showing the emissions that are attributable in the provinces of where the carbon tax applies. So Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. So we see that they account for the majority of farm fuel emissions in Canada. Again, all of those transportation emissions are going to be exempt. We're looking at these provinces accounting for about 2,500 kilotons of stationary combustion emissions, but unfortunately at the provincial level, we don't have that breakdown in terms of how much of that fuel is attributable to liquid and how much is attributable to gaseous. So one estimate we do have was provided by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in a report that was released in 2020, I believe. And they estimated that for grain and oilseed drying specifically, farmers paid $33 million in carbon taxes in 2019. So I've tried to capture that in figure C. So the carbon tax was $20 in 2019. So $33 million total divided by $20 per ton works out to about 1,650 kilotons that farmers of emissions on which farmers face the full amount of the carbon tax. Again, this is just grain and oilseed drying, so there is likely additional amounts that face the full amount of the tax due to home heating or barn heating. So just to note, if we look at the provinces in which the carbon tax applies, the heaviest burden is in Saskatchewan, followed closely by Ontario, and the burden much smaller in Manitoba and Alberta. So in the same AAFC report that provides the estimate of total carbon taxes paid by farmers, AAFC also provides some insights on what is the potential carbon tax burden on farmers. So what they've done is they've taken data that's been submitted by each of the provinces, and they've estimated for each province some figures or some of the costs that I've shown here. So I've just shown the range. The actual Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada report would have the specific numbers for each province. So if we look at these figures, average carbon cost per acre, average carbon cost per farm, average carbon cost as a percent of net income or a percent of operating income, they don't seem that bad, I would argue. When we're looking at costs as a percent of net income or operating costs, they're well below 1%. Obviously, no one wants to incur additional expenses in their business, but if we're just looking at the AAFC estimates, it seems to suggest that these are costs that could be absorbed by farmers without significantly impacting their businesses. But then if we then turn and look at what individual farmers are reporting, we've seen farmers reporting carbon tax bills of up to $10,000. So obviously much higher than the average carbon cost per farm that's being reported by AAFC. So why the discrepancy? So a couple of reasons have been identified. So one is that not all farmers have on-site grain dryers. So when AAFC is calculating their estimates of the average carbon cost per farm, they're looking at all grain and oilseed farmers in a province. So they're looking at carbon taxes paid and dividing by the total number of farms. But a lot of those farms are potentially going to have or will have zero costs if they're sending their grain off-site for drying. So that's really pulling down the average for farmers that do have these on-site grain dryers and which are incurring carbon costs as a result. The other thing to note is that certain grains are more expensive to dry. So if we look at that average carbon cost per acre, the upper end of that range, I believe it's $1.92. That's for grain and oilseed in Ontario as an average. Ontario also submitted a number to dry corn specifically, and that number was $5.50 per acre. So more than double the average cost for all grain and oilseeds. So again, by virtue of averaging out, we're potentially downplaying some of the costs that are faced by farmers that are drying particularly expensive crops and using on-site dryers as opposed to sending their grain off-site. So finally, I just wanted to talk about very briefly some options for additional support to farmers. So this has been a topic of interest for the last couple of years. When the carbon tax was first introduced in 2019, it was a particularly wet year. So farmers had sort of this double whammy of a new carbon tax as well as additional fuel costs that were required as a result of the poor weather conditions and having to harvest their crops at a higher moisture content. So one of the options that's being put forward is an expansion of farm fuel exemptions. So this would effectively add natural gas and propane to the list of fuels that are fully exempt from the carbon tax. So the benefit of this approach, it's administratively straightforward. It's an expansion of a program that we already have in place. The con, however, is that it removes the carbon price signal for farmers on natural gas and propane use. So the second option that's being put forward would be a lump sum rebate to farmers. So this would be similar to the lump sum rebates I mentioned earlier that are currently going out to households to compensate them for carbon tax costs. But this would be directed to farmers to help compensate them for carbon costs incurred as a result of their business operations. So the benefit of this approach significantly is that it preserves the carbon price signal on natural gas and propane for farmers. The negatives, it's a new program, so obviously it would need to be set up, administrative costs in that regard. And the lump sum rebate amount would also need to be defined. You're obviously, when we're talking about farming, we're talking about a wide range of operations in terms of producer size as well as production. The third option would be output-based rebates to farmers. So this is actually the system that's currently used to support large industrial emitters. So it's a fixed amount of rebate per unit of output. So the benefit of this approach, it again preserves the carbon price signal. And because the rebate increases with production, it also provides an incentive to increase production. So if we're worried about Canadian production potentially being crowded out by international competitors as a result of the additional expense of the carbon tax, we would expect that the output-based rebate might be slightly more effective than the lump sum rebate in terms of supporting Canadian farmers' production. Quite a few negatives with this program, however, particularly when you're in the agricultural context, because we're literally dealing with thousands of farmers across the country. So first con, again, it's a new program. Second would be the high administrative costs. So you would now require farms not just to receive, they wouldn't just receive a lump sum rebate, but there'd have to be a reporting mechanism put in place where they're reporting their output to the government and potentially providing verification of that output as well. There's also a disconnect between output and emissions that we have in agriculture. So as I mentioned earlier, that particularly wet year that we had in 2019, we had fuel use go up as a result of the weather conditions. So it would be difficult to define potentially an output-based rebate per unit of the output when fuel use is changing every year as a result of factors that are exogenous to the farmer. And then finally, participation in the program, it would be harder to extend, I think, output-based rebates to all farms across the country, just because of those higher administrative costs in particular. So yeah, so that's everything I had to say about the application of carbon tax. So thanks very much, everyone, for listening, and happy to answer any questions in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was an interesting presentation, and I know we got some really great questions and comments coming in here. So Sarah and Josh, if you want to turn your cameras and your mics back on, we will now get to the Q&A portion. So the first question here, we're going to dive right into a question for Sarah. It says, as you noted, the average carbon cost per farm is misleading for some farms that do dry large quantities of grain, and an average value makes it difficult to understand what the extreme values may be. Is there information available to estimate the range of carbon cost per farm? At the high end, it will be in the tens of thousands.
So that's not something that I personally have come across in the research that I've done. So I'll note I recently released a paper through the Simpson Center, a primer on carbon tax support for farmers, where I dug into this issue a little bit more. And one of the things that I was looking for was trying to get a better sense of what are the costs what are the carbon costs that farmers are facing. And I wasn't really able to find any sort of what you might call official estimates in terms of those full range of costs. All I was really able to find were costs that had been reported by farmers to industrial organizations, for example. And the most common one being thrown around was up to $10,000.
Okay. Another question here, will anyone be addressing the potential for biochar amendments into agricultural soils to reduce NO2 emissions?
I won't. I haven't seen any of that in the. So a lot of the work that I've been doing with the carbon program is looking into the methodologies as to how we estimate ag emissions, and I haven't seen anything in that around biochar applications. That is something that our next couple steps within the program, we will be looking at mitigation strategies and possible improvements to our current ways of estimating, and that's definitely something that we would be looking into.
Okay, great. Question here. This person says, I'm curious about why the data of 2019 was used as a reference point in Josh's slides. Will 2019 be the benchmark year for when farmers will have to reduce their GHG emission relative to 2019 levels? Is that your reasoning there?
I should have been a bit clearer. Our reference year is 2005, in which all the emissions estimates are based off of, or the emission targets are based off of. 2019 is just the most recent data that's available. There's usually about a 2-year lag between when the data is released. And so come April, we'll have the 2020 emission data available. I just used that as a reference for where we currently are and where we need to go with emissions.
Okay, absolutely. Thanks for the clarification there. This question here says, can we hear a bit more about incentives and options going forward? I would note that farm support programs are often capped, which discriminates between large and small operations. Anyone have any comments on that? Josh, maybe, or Sarah? Sarah, you look like you got something to say.
Well, so I do know that, and I apologize, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head. I do know that in addition to this discussion around future carbon pricing support for farmers, that Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada has introduced, I believe it's the Agricultural Clean Technology Program, and that is supposed to support farmers in terms of making some of these transitions. So adopting more efficient, fuel efficient grain dryers, for example, reducing diesel use. I come at this from the energy and environmental policy space. So agricultural is a fairly new area to me. So I can't say anything specific about sort of caps on the program and the challenges that may be faced by small versus large producers.
Yeah, I don't have really anything to add to that. Most of my work's been really focused on the methodologies being used and looking at how changing factors affect emission levels. Haven't had as much time to look specifically at the policies themselves.
Okay, sounds good. Another question here, somebody says, I might have missed it. This is a question for Josh, but for ag emissions from the soil, what is the 11% other that is not included in inorganic or organic fertilizer? And what does CCF stand for?
CCF is going to be urea or liming urea and other carbon containing fertilizers. It's just CO2 emissions being generated from the fertilizer application or from the fertilizers in the soil while they are broken down. The other comprises quite a few smaller categories. You are going to have indirect emissions from the fertilizer use. And that's just a separate measurement within the overall estimates. You also have emissions from the cultivation of organic soils, from the incorporation of crop residual, like the nitrogen that's in the plants or in the crop residual to begin with. You have mineralization of nitrogen within the soil, and there's a few other smaller categories, but the big ones are going to be inorganic nitrogen fertilizer and organic nitrogen fertilizer combined. Again, it's going to be about 60% of that total.
Now, will either of you be taking a look at the economic impact of carbon removal and carbon credit sales for farmers who are sequestering more carbon than they are emitting?
Yes, in the long run, we have a couple papers within the carbon program that look very specifically at those carbon offsets and other carbon pricing, focusing on carbon sequestration. That is also an area that we're going to be moving into within the carbon program once we've gone through a lot of the background material, which is what we're currently going through. The carbon program is spanning over 2 and a bit years. So there is quite a bit of time still within it that that is one area that we are very interested in looking into.
Now, has the idea of carbon border adjustments gotten any traction for agriculture? So that is where tariffs are applied on imports and exports between jurisdictions with differing carbon pricing?
So I guess I'll speak a little bit to that from the energy and environmental policy perspective. So that is a growing area of research in our division. Particularly, we're seeing the EU now look quite seriously at implementing carbon border adjustments. I have to admit, I haven't looked closely at what the EU is doing, so I'm not sure whether the EU proposal also includes agricultural products. I think, certainly with the EU moving in that direction, some of the work that I'm doing at the School of Public Policy is looking at support for large industrial emitters and comparing support across jurisdictions. One of the things we find is that the support is intended to level the playing field, but it's very difficult to do when every jurisdiction is implementing their own programs. So really, if you're looking to create a fair playing field internationally in regard to carbon, I think a border carbon adjustments make a lot of sense. So particularly with the EU leading the way, I wouldn't be surprised to see Canada also move in that direction down the line and potentially have agriculture included in that.
Josh, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, just to expand on that, some of the work that we're doing right now, we're looking at international comparisons of production or emissions per unit of production across these different jurisdictions. And if Canada can compete on its carbon emissions per unit of production, it is going to be very, very competitive, like especially in Alberta and in Saskatchewan, is extremely low emissions per ton of product produced, just because the emissions per kilogram of nitrogen applied is very low compared to international averages given the environment. When we're looking at beef and dairy production, we've also found that it is some of the lowest in the world for per kilogram of live weight per emissions being produced, as well as per kilogram of milk produced, kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of milk produced. So it is fairly competitive, and it might give just another thing to compete on, where Canada could be set up to do quite well.
Okay, now another question here, and thank you for keep submitting your questions. These are great conversations, you guys. If we put a higher carbon price on our farmers and ranchers, what is the potential for carbon leakage out of the Alberta ag market?
So I would say carbon leakage is always something that we're concerned about when we're thinking about implementing a carbon price. So just for anyone who may not be familiar, when we're talking about carbon leakage, we're effectively saying that in a jurisdiction that's imposed a stricter carbon policy, these producers are facing higher costs. So in this specific example, we would have Alberta ranchers and farmers facing higher costs as a result of the carbon price. This makes them less competitive relative to their international competitors, in which case we may see production increase internationally to sort of because they're able to offer their products at a lower price, but then we also see emissions increase internationally, which sort of defeats the purpose of the carbon policy or the carbon tax, right? So you're trying to lower emissions, but instead what you have is effectively carbon leaking to other jurisdictions. So I think one of the things that would be really interesting and that I noted in my research that hasn't been done is to complete what's called an emissions intensity or emissions intensive trade exposure assessment of agriculture. So that's emissions intensive trade exposed. The short version for that is EITE. And that's the federal government, when we're looking at the federal carbon tax specifically, has an EITE definition, as does many provincial programs across the country. And that's effectively used to assess which industries are at high risk of carbon leakage, and then to provide appropriate support to these industries. So that's something that we haven't actually seen completed for agriculture. Alberta has done it for the floriculture production sector, I believe, and the greenhouse growers sector, but more widely, we don't have that analysis. So I think completing that analysis for agriculture would provide a lot of useful information on what is the risk to agriculture of carbon leakage and how can we better support farmers and prevent this from happening.
Okay, thank you. Josh, just somebody's got a clarification question for you here. Can you give examples of carbon containing fertilizers?
Urea would be one.
Okay. Awesome. And another kind of clarification here. Can you speak to expected effects of green technologies? So this person's thinking green ammonia, et cetera. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to really go into a lot of the green technologies with it. So unfortunately, I can't really speak to that.
No worries. Okay, a question which pertains more to grain drying. I don't know if you guys will be able to speak on this, but what is the viable option for farmers to use in grain drying? Can they use electricity? Is it the same cost? Is it greener in Alberta? So for example, coal or natural gas produced anyways. Do either of you have thoughts? Sarah, you're nodding.
Yeah, well, I can start. This was something that I did a fair amount of reading when I was writing the paper that I referenced earlier. So I saw a few options that farmers could potentially take a look at. So one was a report out of Ontario that talked about using a heat exchanger. So that could be an investment that could be added on to a grain drying system that already exists that would help sort of, I believe, recycle some of the heat or energy that's being generated. I hope that's correct. I apologize if not. But the bottom line is that the installation of these heat recovery systems can reduce fuel use. So that would be one option that's out there. Other options that are on the horizon would be an electric grain dryer, as noted. I saw this in a report from a group out of Manitoba. Obviously, the situation is quite different there because Manitoba has a much cleaner electricity grid than Alberta does. I know one of the things that was noted there was how to get sufficient heat with an electric grain dryer. So from my perspective, that seemed to be more of an emerging technology. Just in regards to Alberta's electric grid, I mean, it's an interesting question. I haven't done the analysis myself, but I will note that Alberta is making significant strides in terms of cleaning up its electric grid. I believe coal is scheduled to be phased out by 2023 now, which is ahead of schedule. So, you know, I don't think we should discount the use of electric grain dryers in Alberta. And the last thing I saw was sort of a commercialization of a new technology that is available on the market right now, would be the use of biomass. So waste that farmers are already generating and using that in grain dryers instead. That seemed to me like a really good option. Again, I don't have a lot of technical knowledge of agriculture, but one thing to note for that is when you're burning organic waste or using organic waste as a fuel, emissions from that are called, I believe, biogenic, and they're not subject to the carbon tax because they're just considered to be part of the natural carbon cycle. So I think that would be a good option for farmers.
Anything to add to that, Josh?
No, that's very interesting though.
Yeah. Okay, so another question here. The topic of providing additional carbon pricing support for farmers received political attention at the federal level in the spring of this year. With the new parliament having just opened, do we expect to see this topic revisited, and what additional supports for farmers may be introduced? Sarah, maybe you have some comments on this?
Yeah, so the spring of this year was quite interesting in the House of Commons. So I believe it was back in February 2020 that we had a Conservative MP, Philip Lawrence, introduce a private member's bill. And that bill the bottom line of that bill was to expand farm fuel exemptions to farmers. So to have natural gas and propane added to the list of fuels that were eligible for the farm fuel exemption. So that bill was studied by committee in the spring of this year. And then it was actually passed in the House of Commons with support from every party except the Liberals at the end of June. It was then forwarded to the Senate, but it didn't make it through the Senate. And then with the election that was called in the summer, that bill is, I guess, now dead, for lack of a better word. So the first thing that will be of interest, I think, is whether or not the Conservatives decide to reintroduce that bill. We have a very similar parliament to the one that we had in the spring of this year. So presumably it would again receive support from the Greens, the NDP, the Bloc, and the Conservatives, and could end up going forward to the Senate. So we could actually see an expansion of farm fuel support, or propane and natural gas specifically, added to that list of fuels that qualify for an exemption. On the other side, we have the Liberal government that announced in the budget in April 2021 that they would like to introduce a lump sum rebate to farmers on carbon taxes paid. So the Liberal government is sort of the only party in the House of Commons that's opposing this exemption. They really believe it's important to maintain the carbon price signal. So it will be interesting to see sort of what happens as we move forward, whether the Liberal government pushes ahead with these lump sum rebates, or if the other parties choose to push through the farm fuel exemption bill.
Absolutely. Kind of an interesting question here. We are fairly far north and import a lot of foods. How would our transportation GHG emissions compare to a country like Mexico? Anyone have any thoughts or ideas on that?
Yeah, I'm not really 100% too sure.
Okay, no worries. Sarah, did you have any ideas?
I haven't looked at emissions that are embedded in the food chain. I will I'll put in a small plug for a paper I wrote with a colleague at the School of Public Policy a couple of years ago that looks at sort of production versus consumption-based emissions. It's interesting if you attribute, you see some interesting patterns if you attribute emissions to where they are produced versus to where they're ultimately consumed. But I haven't seen any analysis along that front for agriculture.
So another comment, we have to eat, where some industries are luxury, well, quote unquote, luxury industries. Do we foresee different policies for different industries, say lower reduction goals for agriculture, higher for oil and gas? Is that anything you foresee?
I would say, yeah, that would make sense, especially with agricultural emissions. A lot of ways to reduce emissions, unfortunately, is to reduce production, just given how they're estimated currently. So it would be extremely difficult to see very large emission reductions from ag. Also, with the emissions reductions itself, in terms of total reductions, you're not really at 10%. There's only so much that you can reduce, especially when you look at national emission targets of currently 40% from 2005 levels. So to do that, you are going to see, or you're going to have to see, some fairly significant emission reductions from oil and gas and from transportation, where the emissions measurements are a little bit straightforward and different practices are more easy to quantify, I would say.
We've got another interesting question here. What impacts to the provincial economy do they see when the International Voluntary Carbon Market attracts Alberta producers to sell their carbon removal credits internationally? Sarah, maybe you have some thoughts on this?
So it's actually not a topic that I'm particularly familiar with, but I think I would say that anything that provides a carbon price signal to farmers and which incents them to decrease production is valuable. I mean, I think farmers are, certainly from what I've read, they're adopting new practices. Obviously the industry they're in, they're very conscious of the environment. And if they're taking practices or if they're taking action to reduce emissions and there's an opportunity through international carbon offset markets for farmers to be compensated for these actions, then I think that's a positive.
A question here in regards to infrastructure. I don't know if either of you will be able to comment, but will the electrical grid and electric infrastructure on farms support the high amps and watts required for electric rain drying? Is that even a possibility?
I have no idea on the technical side. I expect it may require some upgrading of current equipment.
Josh, same page?
Yes, unfortunately, yeah.
No worries. So another thought here, looking at agriculture relative to other industrial emitters in Canada, it has both comparable emissions and trade levels. How does carbon pricing support to farmers compared to these other industrial emitters?
So I can take that one on. So that sort of relates a little bit to what I was talking about earlier in that we have these other sectors or large industrial emitters that are classified as EITE and receive carbon pricing support. I think one of the things that really stood out to me when I was doing research in this area is that we almost have agriculture straddling two identities. Like on the one hand, we're saying, the carbon tax is imposing, a negative competitive impact. We're going to fully exempt your emissions from vehicle use, from machinery use in liquid fuels. We don't see those full exemptions in any other industry, but then, or at least not to that level in any other industry. But then on the flip side, we have other categories of emissions that are receiving no support at all. So to me, it was sort of an interesting divergence. If we look at other sectors that we think are at risk of carbon leakage, at risk of negative competitiveness impacts to carbon pricing, then when we're assessing the impact of the carbon price on these industries, we're looking at all of these emissions and we're using all of these emissions to determine the level of support that we're going to provide to these industries. Now, obviously, agriculture is very different. We're talking about thousands of small producers, but at the same time, I think we could be a little bit more consistent in terms of how we're treating farmers. I think we could look at the industry as a whole, say, what is the impact on these farmers from the carbon tax, and then appropriately provide support to all sources of emissions.
Okay, great. Unfortunately, we are, I can't believe how quick that time always seems to go. Anyone have any last thoughts they would like to wrap up the presentation with? No?
I think I'm good.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you. And Sarah, you're good as well?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your participation. Thank you to our panelists, Sarah and Josh. It's a very fascinating conversation, and I think judging by the amount of questions we got in, our audience was very, very interested in it as well. So it's good to keep this conversation going, and thank you for all your time and research. And yeah, if any of you guys that are watching happen to come on halfway through or had to leave early, this will be recorded and this will go up on our School of Public Policy website and our YouTube page, I believe. So be sure to check in on that if you just want to watch it again. And as well, I know these slides will be available afterwards that both Josh and Sarah presented. So they will also be emailed out to you afterwards. So be sure to keep your eyes open for that one. But thank you all for your time. This is unfortunately the last webinar of 2021 for the School of Public Policy. So thank you very much for this year, and I hope you guys all have a great holiday season, and we will talk to you guys in 2022.